Tell you, I was going to stand up here and start out with a number of jokes about Lance, but after all that love fest going on, I'm so warm and fuzzy, I can't even think of anything outside of, are you free tonight, baby? Um, but it's always nice to be back with Lance. It's funny, I remember many, many years ago when he first invited me to one of his events, and I showed up at the DoubleTree, and it was a mob scene in there, and you had balloons in every direction. I remember the balloons. Where are the balloons this year? I missed the balloons. Market's tough. No balloons in a tough market. And here we are. Not only do I continue to do conferences with him, but actually in some levels we've even cooperated in some conferences, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And I actually have him managing my little apartment building out here in the Inland Empire. And of course, on top of everything else, we're somewhat buddies. I think he likes me more than I like him, but don't tell him, all right? But it's interesting is watching his business progress, of course, has changed along the time as mine has progressed as well. And for those of you who've seen me over the last couple of years, you know that I have been making a big deal out of what I call the difference between narratives and reality. And this argument about narratives and reality it's incredibly important because, look, it boils down. If you want to know where the economy is going, you have to pay attention to narratives and you have to pay attention to realities. Because narratives drive decisions, but of course it's reality that determines the outcome of those decisions. But it's not just that. I mean, when you think about the major movement in markets, take, for example, the stock market. What moves the stock market? We always want to think about fundamentals, interest rates, and profits. But what really drives the market is narratives. What happened with the bond market? For a decade, the 10-year bond was running in the 2% range, and then, boom, it reset, and we're in the 4s. What happened? Well, there was a change in fundamentals, but that had been going on for a while. It was the change in narrative that created the tremendous movement we saw that, of course, is still having ramifications for our economy today. And even the housing market. And you talk about the massive changes that happened in housing in 2020. We went from 2019 being an incredibly cold market with Mark Zandi telling us the world was coming to an end, to 2021 where everybody was petrified they were never going to be able to buy a house. And again, that shift, that snap, all happened because of a change in narrative. So narratives are something we constantly have to pay attention to because it doesn't just only drive what I would call long-run changes in the economy. But of course, it's intimately involved with these short-run violent movements we see in our economy all the time. And so you just have to constantly be paying attention to the speech, to look for those big events, to look for those change in narratives, to understand what's going to happen next. And by the way, that has helped me understand a lot about how we got here. But that being said, I will also say that narratives are also things you have to be wary of, right? Now, if you want to just kind of try to do the big picture and understand where we are, well, let's just start with the current narrative. Here we are, it's September. We're 8 months into the Trump administration. Trump came in promising to shake things up in D.C., and whatever you think of Trump, let's acknowledge he's certainly shaken things up in Washington, D.C., and the net result, of course, has been a tremendous amount of noise and hysterics, collapsing consumer sentiment, huge increase in policy uncertainties, and here we go with Liberation Day tariffs and ICE raids and the slowing of the job market, the big revisions we saw yesterday. Of course, travel and tourism is supposed to be collapsing. Real estate veteran warns of hopelessness in housing market, threatening the American dream. How's that for a headline? American consumers on the rope, tariffs and anxiety, and of course, UBS has recently raised its recession probability to 93%. Now, that's a pretty dramatic change in narrative over the course of this particular year, but then again, this has kind of been par for the course. The one thing that this nation has been really good at narrative-wise over the course of the last decade has been this catastrophism or miserableism that has infected every single thing that happens in our world around us. I would like to all recall, like you ought to recall, that in 2019 we were going to have a recession. That one was driven by, of course, the incredible unaffordability of real estate, despite the fact that when I was with you in 2019, I pointed out that housing was a record level of affordability. In 2020, it was the Depression. You remember Nouriel Roubini telling us 10 years of massive unemployment and huge, of course, debt burdens. And Zandy was telling us that a third of all homeowners were going to default on their mortgages. And in 2023, there was a yield curve recession that yet again didn't happen. And this goes on and on and on. So you can't get too wrapped up in that stuff. It reminds me, of course, of John Kenneth Galbraith, who famously quipped that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable, which at the start of my career, I was kind of hurt by. And right now, I recognize he's completely right. Because in a lot of ways, forecasts are as subject to the narrative as anything else is, right? And it's just something you have to pay attention to. Now, by the way, in terms of forecasts, there was another big forecast last year. You remember the mighty Nate Silver in 538? The guy who knows everything about elections? This was a quote from him right before the election. Closest election of the century keeps getting closer. 2 weeks ago, 538 said Vice President Harris had a 58 in 100 chance of winning in 18 days. Wow, but it's getting closer, super close, coin toss, who can tell? And of course, when the election showed up, it wasn't close at all. We all know that. There was a hard right shift. Yet again, narratives are powerful, and the narrative clearly was against that administration, and we ended up with, of course, a new one. And this, of course, brings me to a new expression, which is the only function of election polling is to make economic forecasting look respectable again. It's good to have someone to punch down to, right? Now, while this is all going on and all our panic, there's a whole other narrative that you really need to be paying attention to. And that's not the economic narrative, but the financial narrative. The stock market just keeps going up and up and up. And Bitcoin and cryptocurrency keeps going up and up and up, leading us, by the way, to the second highest PE ratio ever in our stock market. By the way, Bitcoin right now, the market capitalization of Bitcoin is approaching 2.5, work with me, trillion dollars. That means, by the way, that Bitcoin is now worth more than Google, which I'm a little confused about, because no one has ever yet successfully explained to me how something with a PE of zero, a PE of infinity, because there is no earnings, can have any value whatsoever. But here it is. So while we're all incredibly pessimistic about the health of the actual economy, the financial markets seem to think the world is nothing but up, 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 up. What a weird confluence, of course, of narratives in our economy. And by the way, yesterday, we heard about the massive downward revisions in the labor market numbers. 900,000 jobs are going to be removed from the payroll numbers. And as a result of that, the stock market leapt to another new high. Now, again, I understand what they're thinking, which is that 3/4 of a bip rate cut. But honestly, does that make a lot of sense to you? And the answer is, of course not. We live in a world of some really, really strange narratives, both to the positive and to the negative. And you put these together, it helps us better understand exactly what's going on in our world today. Look, last year when we were at Cal Baptist, and even earlier this year, when I was out in the desert working with Riverside in the business conference, I pointed out that you know, I haven't been that worried about the economy. I really haven't. Over the last couple of years, for all the noise and all the chaos, I have not worried. I've been ignoring most of the calls. But over the course of the last few months, I've started to worry about the economy. In fact, we contribute to the Wall Street Journal survey of forecasters. I have raised my probability. I'm still below the average, but I'm more pessimistic. Now, I will be willing to go out and say that as much as I look like I'm kind of meeting everybody else in terms of their pessimism, I think that my vision of why I'm worried is a little different than most economists. Because I truly think that most economists have this idea that the economy is incredibly fragile, and Trump is, shall we say, roughly handling said delicate thing, and that's the biggest worry of all. But that's not where we are by any stretch of the imagination. Look, the economy has been slowing down for a while, okay? It didn't just happen in the last 6 months. It's been happening for a while, and that's because the bubble that has so been violently inflating our economy over the course of the last couple of years has started to stabilize. Now, the bubble I'm talking about, of course, is this incredible surge of growth the nation received. In first, because of the fact that the Federal Reserve just went crazy in 2020 and threw $5 trillion of brand new cash into the economy, a 40% increase in the money supply that blew up consumer demand, expanded the money supply. It made financial markets go absolutely crazy. It created a huge surge in net worth, everything that sent the economy into the stratosphere. I remember my headline in my front slide back then was prepare for liftoff because of how crazy that was. But you know, gravity inevitably wins. And at some point in time, that thrust was going to start fading away. And that's exactly what we've started to see over the last year or so. Things are starting to cool off. Now, Trump, of course, has moved into this particular situation. He's taken over an economy that looks very healthy on the surface, but again, when you look underneath, you recognize that a lot of the good things that have been going on have, of course, been driven by this bubble. Now, Trump is coming into office with a slowing economy, and he doesn't want to see a slowing economy. Remember, he's all about appearances, and for him, the fact that things are slowing down is not politically acceptable. So, one hand, he has a certain inclination to try and reinflate the bubble, and that's exactly what he's doing. The one big beautiful bill, which expanded the deficit, more push to the system. He's deregulating financial markets, allowing for more of the excess going on there, which again would put a little more air in the bubble. And he's been screaming and hollering at the Federal Reserve to cut rates, yet again, to pour more fuel in the fire. But of course, while that's all going on, there's a whole other set of things he's doing, having to do with tariffs and immigration and the DOGE cuts. And all these things are creating turbulence. Turbulence, by the way, that's very good at popping bubbles. So you want to talk about a weird confluence of events. This new administration is trying to inflate and pop the bubble simultaneously. And I got to tell you, trying to forecast that particular situation is incredibly hard. I can tell you right now, we have an equal chance of the economy taking off and going into a recession in the next 6 months, because these two opposing forces are both at play at this particular point in time. Now, take for the sake of argument, both these things are happening simultaneously, right? So that could mean the economy could, let's just say for the sake of argument, the inflation works more than the popping of the bubble. Well, that means the economy grows pretty well over the next year and a half or so, but when the bubble inevitably does pop, it's going to be a much harder landing. And that's the key here. That's what we're dealing with. So in a very real sense, it might be good to have a recession right now, to let a little air out of the bubble. But that's probably not going to happen. We're going to be moving in the other direction. Now, how that shakes out, we're going to come to that at the end of this presentation. As for the housing market itself, I agree, things have gotten really cold yet again. Part of this, I think, goes back to the fact that we came into 2025 with an economy that was slowing down. The bubble was starting to fade. You also have to throw in the present uncertainty, which has clearly got certain people skittish. And I also think that the whole extend and pretend situation is coming to an end as well. For a number of years, people were convincing themselves that mortgage rates, interest rates are just going to be dropping back to where they were. I kept saying, no, they're not. But I think that is starting to creep into people's heads. The whole idea that you're going to marry the house and date the rate, yeah, that's not working so well. Turns out that rate's not going away. It wants to live with you, okay? And I think that also is cooling some of the circumstances, as the case may be. But ultimately, the shortage of housing is still the dominant issue. It's as simple as that. We still live in a capacity-constrained housing world. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons that the market continues to move along despite all these situations. Here in California, of course, those shortages are particularly profound. But what you will find here in the state of California, particularly, is that a lot of our policies about housing are completely wrong. They're moving in the exact opposite direction. They're dealing with issues that don't really exist, and they're ignoring the changes that do need to occur to fix the situation we're in. And that, of course, is all driven yet again by bad narratives. So over and over, we live in this complicated web of a lot of different economic forces with a lot of weird narratives on top of it. And it really is, in 25 years, I could say this sincerely, one of the oddest economies to try and make heads or tails of. I'm getting into species, you know. I typically have a block in the summer where I'm not doing much. I'm getting into it now. And one of the reasons I'm sitting in there is I'm still trying to figure out how to communicate all these various forces and different ways they hit their economy. And bear with me as I try to go through this. Now, all that said, I know Lance is going to have a copy of this presentation. He's going to have a copy of the slides. At the end of the presentation, there's a QR code. You can also get a copy yourself if you'd like to peruse them on your own, as the case may be. There's a lot to go through, so do bear with me. If I'm going through this, you have any questions or comments, by all means, throw your hand up. It's a small crowd. It's a great venue. Happy to talk about it. So you let me know. But that said, I'm going to be piling through some slides pretty quick so we can get Q&A at the end. Now, as already noted, by the way, Drake, can I get some water? Yeah. The economy has slowed this year. There's no doubt about it, right? We had the last couple of years were good. Not great, but good. We had 3% growth. We had 2.5% growth. This year, first half of the year, 1.25%. We had the negative number in the first quarter. Second quarter, not very good at this particular point in time. Some of this is government spending. Government spending has cooled off a lot. But another big hunk of it, which is something to think about, has been a big slowdown in consumer spending. A lot of conversation about that. In fact, consumers added 2% to growth over the last couple of years. This year, it's added less than 1%, about 2/3%. So a big slowdown on that particular front. Business investment still looks pretty good. Net exports is actually kind of a positive, but in general, the big slowdown in government spending and consumer spending, that has been the weak points of the economy. Now, there's still a lot of debate about where the economy is going next. No one thinks there's going to be a recession. No one credible thinks there's going to be a recession in the next 6 months. But there's still a lot of debate about where things are going. The GDP now numbers coming from the Atlanta Fed suggest a 3% in the third quarter. The blue chip is running about 1%. These guys, one set's too pessimistic and the other set tends to be too optimistic. So probably 2%. But again, still muddling through, as the case may be, a relatively slow growth kind of economy. Now, what's going on with consumers? Let's start there. Consumers are 70% of GDP, so you got to pay attention to the consumer. And consumers up till now have been having the time of their life. Lots of foreign spending. Restaurants have been busy. Live Nation can't put on a concert that doesn't sell out unless you're Mariah Carey. And even when you look at some of the numbers, you look at high growth stuff, spectator sports, foreign travel, line entertainment, air transportation. You know, it's not higher education. It's not food that's consuming people's money. People are out there having fun. It's as simple as this. But things have slowed down this year. Part of that, of course, is that disposable income growth has slowed to about 1% in real terms year over year. Real consumer spending, of course, has basically been flat since the start of the year. But what's interesting is when you dive in a little bit closer and take a look at where the slowdown in consumer spending is, for the most part, it's not actually what you think it is. In fact, when you track down, from 22 to 24, but consumer spending in real terms grew about 2.8% per year. It's 2.1% over the course of the last year, so definitely slower. But when you look at the sources of the deceleration, it's really in two areas, almost completely, healthcare and nonprofits. So it's not actually consumers. It's the healthcare system, which is government spending, and nonprofits and all the problems they're having there. This is where the issue is. Consumers are still doing fine. So consumer spending really isn't slowing down all that much. We know credit card delinquencies are up, but foreclosures and bankruptcies are still very, very low right now. So again, no major problem there. And while we're worried about the consumer, keep something in mind that household debt to GDP peaked back in 2008 at about 100%. Today it's down to 70%. And overall net worth, which really took off after, of course, the pandemic and all that crazy stimulus, well, that's still growing. In fact, particularly for the bottom 50%, they're way above where they were prior to the pandemic. So none of this suggests to me that there's any major problem, at least at the surface level, for consumers and consumer demand. Housing market, we all know how cold this is because of that big increase in interest rates. But even there, you're not seeing any kind of distress in the market. For all those increases in prices and interest rates, the mortgage market, even though it's not very busy, still is very, very clean, very high FICO score, the share of debt that's 90 days delinquent for HELOCs and mortgages still near record low levels. And of course, the equity share in real estate today is the highest it has ever been. People have trillions of dollars in wealth sitting in housing right now. This is not a debt-constrained housing sector. This housing sector looks nothing like it did in 2006. From a basic core solidity standpoint, this is one of the most solid housing markets, just not terribly affordable. Now, that said, better signs on that front. Inflation has cooled. The Fed hasn't completely won the battle. Inflation's still above 2%. No, by the way, inflation rates have not been heating up. They keep saying that. Every time inflation ticks up the tiniest bit, the newspapers all scream, here comes inflation again. No, okay? You're not going to have inflation until there's another giant increase in money supply, and there's been no increase in money supply. Worth noting, ergo, yes, price stability is back, and mortgage rates have settled out. They'd even dropped just a little bit at this particular point in time. So again, even here, better news on that front. And of course, the Fed has backed off. It stopped cutting for a bit. It's going to start cutting again. But way more important than that has been quantitative tightening. Remember, quantitative easing gave us the $5 trillion. Quantitative tightening was the Fed trying to pull some of that money back. And they pulled back about 60% of it, but it's worth noting they're pretty much done with that at this particular point in time, which is why bank deposits are starting to grow, and it's easier to get loans from banks. And banks, remember like a year and a half ago, every banker had this like terrified look in their eyes? Well, that's fading right now because deposit growth is positive again, and it's helping them go out and do their job. They don't have to worry about massive runs causing their bank to go ahead and collapse the way it did, say, with Silicon Valley Bank. So here, again, good news, easier to get loans as well. Business investment is nice and strong despite, again, all the negativity. Corporate profits continue to rise. Even the construction market. You know, it's interesting. Yes, we know, of course, all said and done, that high interest rates have slowed down the transactions, but amazingly, real construction spending has continued to grow throughout this period, despite those high interest rates, because we still need stuff. You still need stuff built, particularly on the housing front. Housing construction has been one of the strongest sources of growth within that particular sector. Even manufacturing. All the worries about tariffs, our manufacturing in the United States right now is doing fantastic. Industrial production is at an all-time high level. Manufacturing profits are way above where they were a few years ago. And real value added, the best metric of manufacturing output in the United States, yet again, at a record high level. So even this sector is doing well. So put aside the current slowing, there's no way to look at this economy and not say, hey man, things are pretty damn good. Now, that's not, of course, what people are talking about, right? You pick up the paper, consumer sentiment down. Gallup poll, the percent of the U.S. satisfied with their personal life at an all-time low level in the 25 years they've been collecting this particular data. People are still talking about inflation and how it's hurting American households, despite the fact that inflation at 2.3%, not a big deal. 7 out of 10 college students say the country is headed off on the wrong track. Mainly because their new employer basically said to them, hey, I need you to come to the office 3 times a week, maybe 2 times, please. And, of course, most parents think their children are going to be worse off than they are, which to me still absolutely, I just cannot believe that anybody would say out loud that I think my children are going to have a worse quality of life than me. But this is where we're at, right? The age of miserableism. No matter how good we have it, we're going to find a reason to bitch and whine, okay? That is what it boils down to more than anything else. And like I said, you got to beware the narrative. We have economic realities. I keep pointing this out. We have these social narratives. They are not completely overlapped. And then, of course, you have Lance Martins. And again, these things do not relate to each other necessarily, right? These are all different things. Robert Shiller wrote a book, Narrative Economics. He says, we need to incorporate the contagion of narratives and Lance Martin in economic theory. Otherwise, we remain blind to a very real mechanism for change. And of course, John Maynard Keynes said the markets are moved by animal spirits and not by Lance Martin. And of course, my favorite quote is, it isn't what we don't know that gets us into trouble, it's Lance Martin that gets us into trouble. I've experienced that myself firsthand once or twice, all right? Recently, exactly. So, but again, you got to beware the narrative. Take, for example, this job number we got yesterday. Wow, 900,000 job reduction in labor force. That sounds really scary. That sounds like we're collapsing into a recession. And mind you, this is on top of the slowdown, the downward revisions we've seen over the course of the last couple months. So this is a pretty dramatic slowdown in payroll job growth. And yes, of course, Zandy is immediately screaming recession again, because I'm pretty sure in Zandy's contract with Moody's, it says, I will promise to call for a recession approximately every 9 months in order to make everybody worry about bond ratings. That is his job, right? But with all that said, you got to slow down. Even this idea, what did they say? Really, three cuts? 0.75? On basis of what? Well, the job growth is weak. Look, when economists talk about the economy, when they talk about recessions, you don't look at one number. You don't just look at payroll numbers. In fact, if you go and look at what a recession is, who's heard this idea? A recession is 2 quarters of negative growth. Did you know no economist has ever said that out loud? No credible economist has ever said that out loud. Some newspaper reporter came up with that. Now, the MBER definition of a recession is not quite as much fun. It's not as easy. It basically says you got to look at a whole bunch of numbers, and when a lot of them are negative, that's a recession. And that's more reasonable, but it obviously doesn't lead to dramatic headlines. And the key here, of course, is when you dive into that, well, the unemployment rate, by the way, is still 4%. Well, that's not bad. Dive in a little bit more. It is true that the job openings rate has cooled off quite a bit, but it's cooled off to where it was in 2019 when it wasn't too damn bad. It's certainly nowhere where it was back in 2011 and 2012. It is true that companies aren't hiring much, but then again, people aren't leaving much either. It seems more like there's just more stability in the labor market. People aren't jumping jobs all over the place. And then, yeah, I'm sure that there's some companies holding off because, again, they're just wondering what the hell's going on. But that said, they're not laying people off. There's certainly been no increase in claims for unemployment insurance. So, yeah, okay, we have slow numbers, but there's nothing else that suggests there's any problems in labor market health. Earnings growth continues to move along at a regular rate. And even poverty rates. You know, it's funny. Everybody's panicked. Everybody keeps talking about the have and the have-nots and the bottom 50%, how awful they're doing. But really, over the last couple of years, poverty rates at the official level are the lowest they've ever been. They've been running below 12%. The last time they were this low was in 1999. I don't see a nation starving on its feet. And to be clear, you might say, well, that's still a pretty high number, Chris, and that is true. But when you think about this, this is the official poverty metric, which means it does not include a whole bunch of things we do for poor families. For example, this number doesn't include non-cash public benefits like Medicaid, Medicare. Those are kind of important, right? It doesn't include SNAP, tax credits, non-cash private benefits. It doesn't include all sorts of things. If you include that in this particular data, and by the way, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, does this on an annual basis. It's never talked about, but they do it, and it's a great job. And what do they come up with? Well, according to them, the poverty rate, once you account for all the benefits received, is below 1%. It's the lowest we've ever been. Now, I'm not saying the war on poverty is over, because there's two particular things we got to worry about when it comes to war on poverty. One is, how do you help impoverished family? On that one, we're doing great. The other question is, how do you prevent more families from becoming impoverished? And on that one, we're doing lousy. But that's in large part because most of our policy conversations about this are all wrapped around the idea of how do we give these people more, as opposed to how do we help them earn more. That's the whole feed a fish versus giving them a fish kind of debate. Yet you never hear about anybody preventing poverty, only how we can give people more. And this is a dangerous place for our nation to be. Now, as for this so-called big reduction in jobs we're seeing, look, this has been coming for a while. You have to pay attention to different employment statistics, and there's no doubt that the payroll numbers looked weird. They just did. They were too high. They were too strong. I've been saying this for a number of years. There is something wrong with these payroll numbers. They don't match up to anything else. And lo and behold, we've been seeing more and more downward revisions. In fact, one of the things to talk about is, yes, this is a record run of downward revisions after, of course, an enormous upward revision. And you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you go, what the hell is going on over there? I actually kind of agree. We needed to change the leadership over there. Now, I would tell you, Trump probably got rid of the leadership for all the wrong reasons. He didn't get rid of them because they weren't doing their job well. He got rid of them because he didn't like the results, which is different. But nevertheless, there was a problem over there. And yes, they need to get their numbers cleaned up. There's no doubt about it. Now, part of the issue, though, and I think we need to be reasonable about this, is understanding how hard it is to estimate employment right now. Now you think, well, isn't that easy? Well, no, it isn't that easy, because we're real good at looking at job changes, but ultimately we need to be focused on what I would call job levels. And remember that all our samples in the US are just that, they're samples. And we take those samples and we use other data to raise them up to population estimates. But that all depends on the accuracy of your weights. And our weights right now are really, really complicated because of the fact that we don't fully understand what's happening in terms of our population. Now, what I'm talking about here, of course, has everything to do with immigration. Look, we've had a real problem in the US for years now of labor shortages, and that's because 30 years ago we stopped having babies. And that caused a big slowdown in labor force growth, which has been one of the biggest constraints on the US economy, frankly, in the California economy, for 20 years. Now, there's an easy backstop to this, which is if we don't have enough domestic workers being produced, bring a few of them in, import them. We call it immigration. And that's clearly something this nation has needed. And by the way, despite the fact that our immigration system is broken, given that enormous surge in labor demand in 22 and 23, they came anyway. Now, how many? We don't know. See, this is one of the issues. When people are coming here in an undocumented way as opposed to a documented way, well, they don't typically stop off at the local census workshop and fill in the form, says I'm here, okay? So the census has been really struggling to figure out how many people coming over the border. The CBO created an estimate, and the census was saying, oh, maybe 1 million people came in 22, 23. The CBO is looking at data today, they're going, no. You're talking about 3.5 million people probably came into the United States in 2023. And that is one of the reasons why, again, it was really hard to figure out what the hell is going on. And that huge surge in people, by the way, well, it's a damn good thing they came. Like, whatever your feeling is about undocumented migrants, and whatever your feelings are about people coming over the border, and it's a very contentious issue for obvious reasons. It's scary to think of just anybody walking over that border into our country. I understand that. But at the same time, you also have to appreciate just how necessary this workforce is. Consider this. Over the course of the last 15 years, this nation has added about 18 million workers. Of that 18 million workers, believe it or not, almost 10 million were born overseas. Over half of all new workers in the last 15 years were born overseas. Can you think how bad labor shortages would be right now if it hadn't been for these people coming in here? So yeah, this is kind of a necessary thing. Now over here in California, we're used to it, but the rest of the nation isn't. And you have seen this massive pushback. Now, it's interesting. Go back to that high growth rate we saw in 2022, 2023. One of the reasons the economy was growing so well was because of all this immigration. It's so interesting. We always think about immigrants as, I don't know, a crime risk or stealing somebody's job. Well, how about them picking strawberries in the field? How about them making money and spending the money and helping a local retail shop? How about all the stuff, good stuff they do? And when you look at that, you realize one of the reasons the economy is growing so well is because of these folks. But again, also a big worry for obvious reasons. Now, of course, the constraint here, this is not a hard baby to divide. Go fix the legal immigration system. But of course, that's completely impossible in Washington, D.C. right now. So here's the world we live in. Now, you have the new administration in, and yeah, anti-immigrant, you think? I mean, they're running around basically interrogating people on the basis of the fact that they're brown and they have a little bit of an accent. And a lot of these people, they're harassing. It's obviously incredibly grim. A lot of people are not coming here. And in fact, according to Pew, up to and maybe more than 1.2 million people have already left the economy. So again, why are they having trouble estimating job growth? I think I can figure that out. Oh, we just don't know what the hell is going on, right? But clearly, this is one of the big reasons we're seeing job growth. We're seeing reduced job growth. Now, in the short run, that's not good for growth of the economy, particularly if we want to pay off these trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of federal debt. And of course, ultimately, when you think about where our economy is going, understand that if immigration levels really tail off, we are very close to peak in labor force. Simple as that. And if our labor force starts to drop in the next few years, it's going to be very ugly very quickly. So look, we need immigrants. We need to fix this. This administration is clearly moving the exact opposite direction on the basis of bad narratives, and this isn't a good thing. Now, of course, when it comes to labor shortages, California takes the cake. Look, our state has not been growing very rapidly. We're way behind Texas. We all know about that. One of the slowest growing states out there at this particular point in time. That's true, of course, here in Southern California. Even the Inland Empire, who's been a job machine in so many ways over the course of the last 25 years, has slowed quite a bit. Right now, the Inland Empire is only growing about 1% on a year-over-year basis, which, by the way, makes it one of the faster-growing economies in the state, despite that. I mean, Stockton's growing a little bit faster, but that's that. And we know local job postings have cooled off a bit, although, still fairly positive as the case may be. But putting that to one side, while the state may not be growing in an extensive margin, it's clearly growing very well in the intensive margin. Household incomes continue to grow. The gap between California incomes and incomes in the rest of the nation has never been larger than it is right now. You don't hear this, right? The only thing we hear is about how so many, there was a report yesterday that talks about how 17% of Californians live in poverty. Really? 1 out of 5 people in the state lives in poverty? Does that feel like the California you live in? Again, it's nonsensical, but these are the stories that drive things. Of the 30,200 counties in the United States, no fewer than 11 California counties are in the top 100. Unemployment rates have not been going up. Job openings have cooled off, but they don't look that bad. They're still about the 4% range. They don't look tragically low. Our poverty rate, by the way, has dropped as much, if not more, than the national number. This is official poverty numbers, by the way. It doesn't include all those benefits. So almost assuredly, our poverty rate, our actual poverty rate in California is below 1%, not 17%. It's a crock of bullshit, candidly. But unfortunately, it's that narrative that's driving everything in Sacramento right now. And that's one of the reasons why this state is just drifting and drifting and drifting way down the wrong path, right down the wrong streams. Here in the Inland Empire, incomes continue to go up, poverty rates continue to go down. Well, what about inequality, right? Look, you can't just compare California incomes to the rest of the nation because it's way more expensive here in California. Well, all right, it is more expensive, but that's mainly housing. Cars cost the same. Milk costs the same. Most of the shirts cost the same. Most everything you buy in California costs the same as the rest of the United States, outside of two things. Housing and energy. Those are the two things that are more expensive. On the energy front, believe it or not, it's not that big of a deal because we don't consume as much energy as the rest of the nation does because it's such a great climate. We don't have to worry about heating and cooling constantly, right? We can open our windows once in a while. Try doing that in Rochester, New York, okay? How much more expensive is California? Well, it turns out we have numbers for that. The BEA has these RPPs, these regional price parities. It turns out when you include regional price parities, at every decile, Californians make more money than people in the rest of the nation, even when you include our higher cost of living. So no, we don't have legions of impoverished people living here. It's just, that's not the truth. This is a very wealthy, well-off state. Now, we do have more income inequality, but it's not because we have lots of poor people. It's because we have lots of rich people. And that's a different game. As for the labor force differences, the growth differences, it's not complicated. We don't grow our population. Ergo, we don't grow our labor force. And that happens because we don't grow our housing supply. Look, here's the most depressing statistics I can give you. In the last 5 years, Texas has added 1.7 million people to their labor force. California has added 120,000. There it is in a nutshell. It's not complicated. If you're not going to let people move here, you can't grow your labor force. You can't grow jobs. It's as simple as that. And that, of course, is exactly why inland parts of the state have been the dominant source of job growth in the state. Here's a statistic for you. Over the last 5 years, the Inland Empire in the Central Valley, you know, those poor, tragic, impoverished, backwards communities that the coastal areas have to just lift out of their misery. Well, they've added 2/3 of all jobs, 1/3 in the Inland Empire, 1/3 in the Central Valley. 2/3 of all new job growth in the state have been in this stretch of the state. Sacramento is 1/6 more. San Diego, 1/8 more, and San Diego is the last eighth. Okay? That's it. Everybody else is a wash. So yeah, and that's all driven, of course, by labor force growth. Now, when you take a look a little closer, yeah, we see it, you know, that's the education, healthcare, government, but there's other things. You know, professional scientific services is actually picking up. Logistics jobs, which when I was with you last year were cooling off a lot because the goods economy was cooling off, well, they're growing again. So logistics is back, people. It's picking up again. There are good things happening on that count. Now, manufacturing's down a bit, construction's down a bit, leisure and hospitality's down again. But on net, the real problem here, of course, remains a lack of workers. How do you fix that? Well, you got to grow population more. I thought the population was leaving. Well, they are. They have seen more people leave than come in. But keep something in mind. They're not being forced out. They're being encouraged to leave on the basis of something called the price mechanism. It's very simple. Yes, the population's dropping, but it's worth noting that the housing vacancy rates are the lowest they've ever been. How do you square that? Well, the real issue here is that people in California are doing so well, they're spreading out. There's been a big decline in people per household. The fastest growing demographic household in California is a single person living in a 2-bedroom apartment. That is what's happening in our state right now. That, of course, is the problem. When people spread out, someone has to get out. How do you encourage them to get out? By pushing prices up. We hear all the time that we have an affordable housing crisis in the state of California. I cannot tell you how those words make my, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard, okay? It's like when someone overuses the word literally. We do not have an affordable housing crisis in California. There is no such thing as an affordable housing crisis. That world doesn't exist. Housing is incredibly competitive. What you have is housing shortages. And when you have a housing shortage, that causes the price to go up. Just like if you have a strawberry shortage, the price of strawberries goes up. Or if you have a shortage of gasoline, the price of gasoline goes up. If you have a shortage of housing, the price of housing goes up. Now, what does the increase in price do? Well, it causes certain consumers to take a step back and leave the market. That's the point of the price mechanism. The price of strawberries goes up. People are like, meh, I could take them or leave them. They're going to go buy something else. But the people who really need strawberries are going to go ahead and buy them. And that's exactly the same here. There is no shortage of affordable housing. There is a shortage of housing that makes it unaffordable for a group of people who thus choose to leave. That is what's going on in our housing market, and that can only be solved with housing. And despite all, of course, of the conversation and the policy changes, nothing has happened. Single-family permits in this state continue to run 4,000 to 6,000 a month. Texas continues to build between 10 and 14,000 units a month, well over twice our supply. And we have high wood costs and high this and high that. No. If Texas can do it, we can do it. Clearly, we are the problem. This is not a cross for us to bear. This is a cross that we built. It's different. And until we address this, you're not going to change the situation. And you can see it here in Southern California, particularly in the coastal economies. Look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles has expanded its occupied housing stock by 7.3%, but the population's down by 2%. Why? Because there's been a 9% decline in people per household. And they're spreading out. Every new housing unit built in Los Angeles has been used by someone local, by local increases in local demand. No wonder people have to leave. And if you look out here in the Inland Empire, if you look at San Bernardino, you look at Riverside, very similar sort of trends, particularly in San Bernardino. We had 3.3 people per household 20 years ago. Today, it's about 3.12. It doesn't sound like a big change, but that kind of change in a stagnant housing stock creates enormous pressures on prices. How do you fix it yet again? More housing, more housing, more housing. It is not happening here. Simple as that. And that, of course, is our largest problem. But,
if we didn't have a high enough birth rate, if people are leaving California, more people are leaving and coming in,
yeah.
how is there a shortage?
Well, again, people are spreading out. Big decline in people per household.
Is it also because of the amount of immigrants that are coming in?
Well, the people who are coming in, and yes, there's a big demographic shift happening as well. And that's true. So there's two things happening. Part of it is I'm doing so well I don't want to live with roommates. Part of it is I'm not going to live with my parents anymore. But part of it is families who are housing cost sensitive, say with kids, they're like, I got a bills to pay with kids. I'm going to go somewhere else and raise my kids, and housing costs cheap. Who's moving here? Well, who doesn't care about housing costs? A 27-year-old with a master's degree who's just living the dream. Or whatever, they'll find a place. They're fine. And that's what's going on. So it's a demographic shift as well. But I want you to say over and over, housing prices are a function of supply and demand for housing. It's such an important point. We don't have a shortage of affordable housing. Housing is totally affordable for the people who can afford it. And if you can't, there's the exit. Now, look, I'm not saying that this is a good thing. It's not a good thing. I don't want the state to turn into Switzerland, because that's what Switzerland is. It's a bunch of old rich people, okay? And, sure, they're good in the golf club, but they're not very nice to look at. I like young people, okay? And we need an economy that's here for everybody. And we're not doing that right now. And again, it's our choice. Now, you might say, hey, wait a minute, why would anybody build a house right now anyway? Hey, a Gallup poll recently came out. Do you think it's a good time or a bad time to buy a house? This goes back to 1978. And the peak was about 2004. Bad time to peak, by the way. And since then, it's absolutely plummeted. Over the last 2 years, never has it been such a bad time to buy a house. Well, why? Well, because no one can afford a house. Every time you pick up the paper, they're talking about how unaffordable housing is. How unaffordable is housing? Well, it's definitely less affordable than it was a couple years ago. There's no doubt about that. It's less affordable than it was when we had 2.5% mortgage rates. I will concur with that. But that said, it isn't that unaffordable. It's kind of unaffordable at the place we were back in 2007. It's better affordability than it was in 1987 or 1988. So no, it's not that unaffordable. It's modestly unaffordable, but it's not violently unaffordable. And this idea that it's the worst time ever is nonsensical. But again, this is the narrative. How many kids have walked up to you and are moaning, oh, it's not fair, which is what they say all the time, it's not fair. By the way, I've looked through many textbooks in economics. I've never found any textbook in economics that discusses the meaning of the word fair, okay? That's a completely human construct. But they always go, oh, it's not fair. What? Oh, I'll never be able to afford a home. My parents afforded a home. Yeah, you know how your parents afforded a home? They scraped and scrimped and saved and fought like hell. They didn't go to Erewhon for a $20 smoothie, okay? It wasn't easy, but we have built this narrative, and it's nonsensical, as the case may be. And of course, 2019 was bizarre. 2019, we were told there was going to be a recession because housing costs were so high. I mean, wow, how weird. Now again, the power of the narrative to change markets, to cause massive changes in markets, on display in 2020. Unbelievable. Clearly, housing was incredibly well priced, but the narrative held everybody back. What happens when a narrative changes dramatically? Well, we saw it in 2020, right? At the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic was here, everybody was sitting on the sidelines waiting for prices to fall because Zandy told them prices were going to fall. And they all sat there, and they all sat there. And then the pandemic hit, and piles of money came in, and people had to save because you couldn't spend. And then interest rates dropped, and we hit a point in time where suddenly, okay, I think we need to go out and buy a house. And they put their mask on because they heard there was an open house around the street, and they walked around the corner to take a quick look, and they saw a line of 947 people. And there were 88 offers. The winning bid came in at 28% over ask. And we went from, I'm waiting for home prices to fall, to, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. And in the midst of that, we saw one of the most insane explosions of market activity ever. Huge increase in sales and prices. I mean, look at this. Tampa prices went up by 64% in 2 years. Dallas, 54%. Las Vegas, 50%. This is way faster than what happened around the Great Recession. We've never seen anything like it. But of course, that all came with all the stimulus, and then the inflation, and then the Fed breaking, and then with the inflation, well, then the bond market narrative changed. And when the bond market narrative changed, boom, the 10-year exploded, the 30-year fix exploded, and the party was over. Simple as that. Now, in the end, the other thing is a decade of not buying that affordable house also left to a decade of not building enough housing. And we still don't have enough housing after a decade of subpar growth. It's as simple as that. And that is exactly why home prices have been maintained. You saw the numbers. Yeah, they're down a bit, but look at where they were since 2020. Here in the Inland Empire, Riverside, prices are down 0.9%. Uh-oh, they're up 48.7% from where they were prior to the pandemic. San Bernardino, basically flat, up 48% from where it was prior to the pandemic. So prices are still very, very high. They're certainly not going down by any stretch of the imagination. And this shortage is exactly why home construction continues apace, despite, of course, all the issues. And here in the Inland Empire, again, there's been decent numbers, not enough, but at least there's been a continuation of permits. I'd like to see a lot more, but it has struggled through the increase in interest rates. But you know, it's unusual. Usually real estate agents and housing developers are miserable at the same time, or you're all ecstatic at the same time. But we do have an interesting world right now because real estate agents are miserable, but housing developers, they're doing pretty good. They're okay, right? And they're moving forward. But it's not easy even for them. Inventories of new homes for sale are climbing. Why? I thought there was demand. I thought there was a shortage. Why are there inventories of new homes? Why haven't new home sales caught up sufficiently? What's the problem? What's preventing the market from re-equilibrating quickly? And the problem is the housing market, the way it typically works, is not operating right now. Now, what I mean by that, go back to the story I said, there's no such thing as a shortage of affordable housing, right? Go the next step on that. Well, what should we build? We should build affordable housing. What does that mean? You can't build affordable housing. That doesn't exist. You can build enough housing to make it affordable. But no, I mean affordable housing. We got to make cheap houses. Look, if you build teeny tiny little homes, they're still going to be expensive because there's not enough of them. There's no such thing as building affordable housing. And that's exactly why you want a market with good liquidity. Because the fattest margins in home building are in the high stuff, the nice stuff, the fancy homes, the fancy apartment buildings. And that's fine. If that's where they need to operate, let them build there. Let them make their money. Let them build lots of homes. In fact, let's build them so many homes that they squeeze some of that profit margin out of building the big fancy homes. Well, that's not good for poor people. Yes, it is, because of the filtering process. It works very simple. You build a fancy new home, and then people from the starter homes move into fancy new homes. And then because the starter home is vacant, people move from apartments into that starter home. You build at the top to supply at the bottom. And anybody who poos that, typically people on the left, oh, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. Oh, doesn't it? Do you believe in gentrification? Oh, of course, that's a huge problem. Gentrification is the opposite of filtering. If you don't build at the top, well, that high-income person moves into that entry-level home, squeezing somebody else out. That's San Francisco in a nutshell. So yes, this is an important process. Now, the problem, of course, is you see that person in the middle? They're not moving. Why? Because they have a 2.75% 30-year fixed rate mortgage that you will pry from my cold, dead hand. Oops, sorry, I made that personal. So they're not moving, and the net result of that is you got to build directly to the people who want it. We have to build entry-level housing right now. We need to be building condos. Good luck with that, given some of the liability laws we have in California. We need to be building townhouses. Oh, good luck with that, with the permit fees per door and limitations on zoning. So all the stuff we need to be building is really hard to build. But you know, that's one of the reasons why supply is not catching up faster, because we're not paying attention. In fact, there's been an enormous mobility declines in the last few years because so many people are locked down. And yes, this is a problem. And there's a broader point I want to make here, which is important for your industry. And it's important for the state overall. And I'm just talking. Am I good on time?
Yep.
Okay, just keep going. All right. Look, whenever I talk to real estate groups, there's a general line. And you got to go to Sacramento. You want Sacramento to do things that are good for your industry. What do you tell them? Well, one of the standard lines is, well, every time a house is sold, that creates 9 jobs. Have you guys heard this, right? This is the impact study. By the way, that doesn't work in Sacramento. And well so. It's kind of nonsensical. Oh, I see. So we want to make people buy and sell homes so you guys can have jobs? Really? Oh, we should build highways to nowhere so construction guys have jobs too, right? Or we should produce widgets that nobody wants so manufacturing guys have jobs. It doesn't make any sense. However, the real argument to be made is we need housing liquidity because housing liquidity promotes efficient housing markets. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, think about it. What's the problem with the lack of housing liquidity? One problem is we can't build enough because it's hard to build in the middle level, but there's no point in building at the high level if people are not filtering up and down. There's another issue. A problem with liquidity means we take our current housing stock and we don't allocate it efficiently. You know, you have 80-year-old women living in a 5-bedroom house in Irvine. Why? Oh, I can't afford to sell. Prop 13, my low interest rate. Where am I going to go? Well, that's horrible because next door in a 2-bedroom house is a 5-person family. So there's all sorts of reasons to want market liquidity for the efficiency of the housing market, for constructing the housing market, for using the housing market, to create maximum value in the housing market. You want a liquid market. And a liquid market needs a series of rules that allow for liquidity and a series of professionals in the middle of that market, in the middle of that liquidity, making sure people are making good decisions. That's the value. That's the real reason real estate agents, the real estate industry needs to be there. Not the idea that it creates jobs. It's the wrong way of looking at it. Now, all that said, look at everything we do to prevent it. I mean, look, what helps liquidity? We need market information. They're trying to shut down the multiple listing service. You need dedicated professionals. You need functioning lending markets. But what hurts liquidity? Well, massive changes in mortgage rates. You don't want mortgage rates to go from 2.5% to 7.5% in 8 months. That's horrible for market liquidity. High transaction costs, particularly these mansion taxes that a lot of cities are engaging in. That's terrible. Pocket listings are bad. Mansion taxes, Prop 13, rent control, barriers, all these things hurt liquidity. And all of these things are making our housing situation, our housing shortage situation, even worse. There's a value of liquidity, but you're not going to get these changes until someone goes to Sacramento and convinces them that indeed housing liquidity is something you want. Right now, they don't see it that way. Again, the anti-market narrative that goes on in city halls and in Sacramento right now is unbelievable. Look at the big fires we had in Los Angeles. Tragic and terrible. Best thing you can do for these neighborhoods is help them rebuild fast as possible. And by the way, part of that means liquidity. Look, your typical 75-year-old, they don't want to have time to rebuild their house. Someone with kids, you got to get your kid into a school now. You don't have time to wait around for 4 years. And by the way, even for your mere mortal, trying to rebuild a house in this state is a nightmare. The best thing that can happen for most of these displaced people is to sell that lot and get the hell out. and let somebody go in and rebuild it, some professional who could do it rapidly. Perhaps they can buy 7 or 8 or 10 lots and build 10 houses simultaneously and achieve massive cost savings. So what does our fair governor decide to do? To make it illegal for speculators to call landowners. What the hell are you doing? Because in their weird narrative world, every transaction has a winner and a loser. The exploiter and the exploited. That's how they see it. But that's not what market transactions are about. In the immortal words of Milton Friedman, the reason transactions take place is because there are benefits to both parties. Markets help everybody, not just one person. But again, we live in a world where the narrative has changed, and every market is evil. And that's a shame, because we're going in all the wrong directions. And when it comes to housing policy, yet again, oh, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? It's very simple. Get the hell out of the way. It's not complicated. Deregulate. And there's been efforts. Scott Wiener, time after time after time after time, is constantly put into deregulation efforts into it, and it fails and it fails and it fails and it fails and it fails. Why? Because deep down inside, we don't want housing. Oh, we like to whine about it, but we really don't want any housing. And I know this because guess what? Everything that Scott Wiener tried to do at the state level and failed, we can do at every city level. Every one of these rules can be done. Transit-oriented zoning reform, that can happen in San Bernardino and Los Angeles cities just as easily as it happened at the state level. Why haven't they done it? I don't know. I know why, because we don't want it. And then, of course, we had our CEQA reform, and everybody was happy about CEQA reform. Really? Did you look closely at that thing? First of all, it took us years and years and years and years to get CEQA reform. And this is, of the 1,000 cuts that have killed housing, CEQA is 50 of them, maybe 75. So it was only a small part of things. And then when you look what they actually did, yeah, they made some modest positive modifications, and it came with all sorts of poison pills, insane number of poison pills, from these VMI nonsense. And, of course, it's limited to short structures, which doesn't really help. It's only for infill development, not for greenfield, which is what the state needs to be heavily investing in. I mean, you heard it, he said, I got to get my CEQA reform done on my giant development. Why? Why should he have to do CEQA? We need those homes. Inland Empire needs those homes desperately. Get the hell out of the way. You got rid of CEQA for the stadium. Why not get rid of it for his development? Why does he have to bother with this? But it's about affordability. Well, not really. Look, homeownership rates have actually been increasing. Homeownership rates in the Inland Empire bottomed out about 2014 at about a little over 60%. Now it's above 65%. Despite all the increases in prices, homeownership rates are going up, not down. As for cost burden, in 2018, 39% of the people in the Inland Empire were quote-unquote cost burden. Today it's 40%. That's no increase. There's no change. Despite all the increases in prices, you haven't seen an increase in cost burden because prices are reflecting the incomes of the households buying them. It's as simple as that. Well, what about new buyers? Well, even there. Look, in 2013, the new buyer spent 31% of their income on buying a house. Today it's 35.6%. It's a few percentage points higher. It's not the end of the world. It's not that unaffordable because remember, the people who are able to buy this incredibly limited stock tend to be relatively wealthy. They're doing fine. It's not an affordability issue. And some of this comes back to the question you were asking about people who are moving in here. Look, young people, low-skilled people are moving out. Older people, and of course, more skilled, higher-income folks are staying here. And so, yes, this is part of the process driving everything. Even on the apartment front. Apartments, by the way, huge surge in asking rents during that crazy period, but since then they've gone flat. Asking rents have been flat for 2.5 years. I'm going to say that one more time. Asking rents have been flat for 2.5 years. How many cities are talking about rent control? How many cities are worried about evictions? Why? What's going on? Oh, it's affordability. Did you know that renter incomes are rising faster than homeowner incomes in the state? For some of the same reasons. A, they're doing great because of tight labor markets, and B, our new renters are pretty high income. Take Riverside County, 36% median rent to income in 2013. Today it's 34%. It's lower today than it was a decade ago. So we don't have a rental house affordability problem. And yes, these folks are spreading out as well. Renters are spreading out just as much as everybody else. Well, how about that 75th percentile, the people who are really in tough shape? Well, even here, oh, sorry, that's a different graph. There it is right there. Riverside, well, 60% in 23, 75%, 58% in 2023. Again, there's no crisis. But all we can talk about is this crisis. Unbelievable to me that this is where our focus is on, all because of bad narratives. Now, how do narratives go astray? I'm not going to get into this, but read Daniel Kahneman, read Jonathan Haidt, incredible books. And it basically tells us when it comes to particular emotional, political issues, we don't think, we don't reason. Our emotional brain takes over. That's Daniel Kahneman's type 1 thinking, fast, emotional, based on heuristics. We just react. And you've seen this. Anybody, my father spent the last 8 years of his life watching Fox News. And I would try to have reasonable conversations about the junk he was seeing on that network. Now, mind you, your parent might have been watching CNN and you might be having exactly the same conversation at the other end of things. But it was amazing because I tried to have a conversation with him. And it was like talking to a wall. Because there was no type 2 thinking. There was no deductive. It's just twitching, emotional thought. And this is where human beings are. This is what we are. We don't think as much as we think we think. And that's true for everybody, particularly Lance. He's so nice to me, and I just kept hearing beat on him. But it's all in love. It's all in love. Look, how do narratives go astray? This is my favorite graph because it tells me so much what's going on. The Federal Reserve does this. They ask a whole bunch of people, how are you doing financially, right? How well are you doing? And they ask, two of the things, we're doing okay or living comfortably. And in 2017, 74% said they were doing okay or living comfortably. And by the way, in 2024, 73% said the same thing. So really, there's been no change. I would actually argue people are better off, but we're never happy. So that's fine for me. That's a win. I get that. What's really interesting is when you ask them, how is the rest of your neck of the woods and how's the rest of the nation doing? What share of them are doing okay or living comfortably? And look how these numbers are lower and falling. So the average person thinks they're doing just fine, but the average person thinks the average person is doing terrible. Just let that wrap around your head for a few seconds. That's the world we're in. This is the narrative bubble we're in. It doesn't make any sense. I've used this before, but it just works. I like to point out, 90% of parents think their kids are above average. It doesn't work like that, right? Lance has got 2 boys. They're sitting over there. Statistically, one of those guys is a dumbass, okay? I'll let you guys guess. Lance won't tell me. I keep asking, but he said, I'm not telling. One of them has to be. But that's the world we live in, right? And of course, when you think about Trump's win, understand it was because of this anger, because of this dissatisfaction, because of this narrative, the inflation situation, and of course, all this came from this guy right here, Jerome Powell, the man at the bottom of this mess we're in right now. Honestly, this guy, we're all thinking, oh, he's got great hair and he's so well-spoken. He has been the biggest disaster for this nation since the guy who ran the Federal Reserve in 1929. Simple as that. Simple as that. He's been a train wreck, and his legacy continues to bedevil this nation. I mean, look, Trump is here. What's the first thing he wants to do? Tariffs. Really? Look, I talked about we don't have enough workers. You know who has enough workers? Canada and Mexico. Canada, incredible pace of immigration. Unbelievable in the amount of immigrants moving to Canada. Mexico, huge number of babies. It's amazing how many babies they have in Mexico. Combination of the two means labor force growth south and north of us is over twice the pace here. And so when we slapped all the tariffs in China, we had onshoring. But now, of course, we're going to go after these guys. And that's been the big bugbear over the course of this year. Liberation Day, the tariffs going into place everywhere. By the way, why? Because we need manufacturing jobs. This is my favorite headline recently. 80% of Americans say the country would be better off with more manufacturing jobs, but only 25% wants one. That's Americans in a nutshell. Yeah. Now, honestly, we had this massive panic about tariffs early in the year. And I know this is going to sound weird, but it'll make sense in just a second. Make sense in just a second. But when the tariffs and all the debate over tariffs were hitting, that's when I started that's when I started increasing my recession probabilities. But to be perfectly clear, I did not raise my recession probabilities because of the tariffs. Huh? Well, first of all, let me explain. Tariffs aren't that big of a deal. They're not. And I know you keep hearing the opposite, the end is nigh and everything else. But let's just, in proportion, if we had a 20% across the board tariff on everything, that's a $600 billion tax. Who's going to pay that $600 billion tax? The answer is exporters are going to pay a big hunk of it, and importers and manufacturers are going to pay a big hunk of it. And that's exactly what happened. It's remarkable how little of these tariffs have actually worked their way through to the consumer. There's been no increase in prices. We've absorbed it. And even if a couple $100 billion finally does squeeze through, a couple $100 billion tax on $21.5 trillion of disposable income, that's not the issue. That is not the issue. And of course, on top of everything else, turns out the tariffs aren't as bad as you think they are, in part because the vast majority of stuff coming out of Canada and Mexico are not subject to tariffs, even with the tariffs put on those particular places, because if they meet the restrictions placed on them by NAFTA or whatever the hell they call it now, then it doesn't matter, they're tariff-free. And most do. In fact, according to current numbers, 90% of imports from Canada and 83% of imports from Mexico don't qualify for the tariffs because they meet the conditions under NAFTA. So it really hasn't meant anything for our nation. And yes, California exports, California imports are doing just fine. And you know, when you take a look at industrial, the big hit to industrial happened over the last couple of years. Oddly enough, with all the tariff and all the worries about trade, this is when industrial started to stabilize. So industrial actually looks better right now. And if you see better leasing activity, in fact, there's been more signs of people starting to build again, because industrial is the wave of the future, which is exactly why, of course, we passed AB 98 last year in order to try and make it difficult to build more industrial. No good thing, right? By the way, we're working on this right now. We're trying to pull together a big study talking about the industrial ecosystem. In fact, I'd like to talk to you after this. About this particular industry. And again, setting the narrative right about industrial real estate. The narrative on industrial real estate is the only thing they are these big trans-shipping warehouses that take junk from China and deliver it to brats in Minnesota, okay? And the only thing we get is traffic and bad jobs. Well, the actual ecosystem in our industrial space is way bigger than that. And it does a lot more than that. And it contributes a phenomenal amount to our local economy. And what we're doing here is we're throwing out a whole bunch of babies with the bathwater, again, on the basis of bad narratives. Ultimately, the reason I was worried about tariffs was the bigger problem. The problem I started with, the idea that the U.S. economy that Donald Trump inherited was overheated. And you could see that overheating in no better place than the U.S. trade deficit, which over the last year and a half has been, in real terms, about $1 trillion. Now, trade deficits are not driven by foreign trade barriers. That is one of the biggest lies and myths of international politics. A trade deficit is the gap between what a nation consumes and what it produces. If we have $1 trillion trade deficit, that's because we are consuming $1 trillion more than we're producing. We're in the midst of a consumption binge. And some of that is going to households in terms of excess consumption there, and some of that's going to businesses in terms of excess, of course, investment. Some of that goes to the federal government and their ability to hand out even more goodies to all sorts of special interest groups. But whoever is doing it, in the end, our nation's overconsuming. And the source of that excess consumption is in part the asset bubble I talked about, and in part, of course, that federal deficit, which last year was $2 trillion. And again, $2 trillion. Understand, if we wanted to close a deficit right now, you'd have to raise taxes on every single American household by $15,000, 8% of disposable income. Why do people feel rich? Why are they spending so much? Because we don't have to pay for all this government spending. We have a false sense of our income. That is the problem right there. And if you want to look at it modestly differently, we say, well, the household savings rate looks good. It's about 5%. But once you include the negative savings from federal government, our actual net savings rate for the nation is negative 5%. We're borrowing from the rest of the world. Household debt, well, it looks like I told you before, household debt's only 75% of GDP. But you have to look at our other source of debt, which is the public debt, which we all share. You throw that in, turns out overall debt on American households, once you include our obligation for federal debt, is nearly 200% of GDP. So we're up to our eyeballs in debt. We're spending more than we're earning. But we don't know it because the federal government's doing it on our behalf. But it's there. And of course, understand how important government spending is. Remember I talked about poverty? And I talked about all those government programs? Let's understand how far that's gotten. Back in 1965, when we started officially measuring poverty, American households, about 7.5% of disposable income came from the federal government. In 2024, last year, 20% of disposable income in this nation came directly from federal expenditures. 20%. So needless to say, if the federal government has to cut back on expenditures, households are going to feel it. So what's going to cause that to happen? And by the way, the OBBA, I should point out, the OBBA, I want to be clear. Did I approve of this? Hell no. Did it massively expand the deficit? No. It maintained the current deficit. The deficit was supposed to automatically close because of the expiration of Trump's tax cuts. The vast majority of the One Big Beautiful Bill was to extend those, thus keeping this deficit going. In other words, continuing the trend. So if we're not saving it, we're consuming it, who is paying for our debt? Who is paying for excess consumption? And the answer is the rest of the world. In the tune of $1 trillion a year over the last 2 years, there have been massive inflows of capital into the U.S. economy. $1 trillion a year. The last time we had a number of inflows of hot money pouring into our nation was in 2006 and 2007. Not a good comparison, to say the very least. Now, what is stimulating this huge increase of money flowing into the nation at this particular point in time, funding all these excesses? And the answer is they're not here to buy government treasuries. That's not what they're doing. What are they buying? Well, they're buying, of course, the stock market. They're buying our cryptocurrency market. They're buying our real estate. They're buying U.S. yields. Because U.S. yields are better than any other yields in the world right now because of the bubble we're in the midst of. There's the rub. Money is pouring into this nation chasing yields. Unfortunately, those yields are fake. They're based on a bubble. What happens when that bubble comes to an end? The yields go away. What happens when the yields go away? That money goes away. What happens when that money goes away? Well, we have to start self-funding our government deficit. How does that occur? Big increases in borrowing. That means big increases in domestic interest rates. And, of course, inevitably, a cut in government spending. So we are standing on a very, very, very fragile egg, folks. And, yeah, it's a bubble. I mentioned that already, right? I mean, second highest PE ratio ever. Bitcoin, over $100,000 a year. Again, what the hell is cryptocurrency? What is it? By the way, if Bitcoin's too expensive for you, invest in Fartcoin. It's a hell of a deal. You know, Fartcoin, that's a joke, right? No, it's real. It's real on top of everything else out there. A Fartcoin, by the way, is a very affordable $1.17 the last time I looked. The market capitalization was $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion of what? That's insane. The overall crypto market is $4 trillion. And now because of deregulation, we have stablecoin. Stablecoin. You're going to stabilize a bunch of phony assets, valueless assets? How are they going to stabilize? Guess what they're going to do? They're going to take that money and they're going to invest in treasuries. That's what the law allows them to do. They could take the cash, invest in treasuries. This scares the crap out of me. Because when the bubble pops, they're going to have to start dumping those treasuries on top of everything else. So we're building an enormous house of cards. Be fearful when others are greedy. Watch out. Now, how does this end? We saw it a little while ago. When I got worried at the beginning of this year, it's because when the panic, the narrative over tariffs hit the economy, the stock market started dropping. And at first, we saw exactly what happens. The stock market drops, the bond market rallies, interest rates come down. Yay! And then the bond market changed, and the bond market dropped, and interest rates started going up. Why? Because the dollar started to drop. For a week and a half, we had the holy trinity: declines in stock prices, declines in bond prices, and declines in the US dollar. That right there is what is going to happen when things start to fall apart. Now, since then, we've backed off. We've realized tariffs aren't that big of a deal. Things have calmed down a bit in D.C. We're getting normalized to the chaos, and we've settled back into the equilibrium we were in. But the problem hasn't gone away. We're still a nation consuming too much. We're still a nation with an excessively high dollar. We're still a nation who isn't truly suffering the consequences of this out-of-control government borrowing. But at some point in time, reality has to intrude. Now, where's the Fed in all this? Well, the Fed is between a rock and a hard place. Look, at one level, if you say, what should the Fed be doing? The answer is they should be jacking up interest rates to cool off the damn financial markets. But of course, we understand the politics of that particular choice at this particular point in time. Everybody wants them to cut. On the basis of what? Well, the economy's slowing down. The economy needs to slow down. But we don't like that. We don't want that. And by the way, let's say things start to fall apart. You cut the federal funds rate. There's a certain concept in economics called the uncovered interest parity, which says, by the way, that when you cut interest rates, basically there's less demand to be in the United States because of lower interest rates, and the dollar starts to drop. The dollar starts dropping, creates both inflationary pressures, and of course it causes the yield of investing in the United States to drop as well. And that means a little less money. So the Fed doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver. Now, they probably will cut. Lord knows everybody's been screaming at him, not the least of too late Donald Trump himself, too late Jerome Powell, is costing our country hundreds of billions of dollars. But again, go back to what I just said about the relationship here. Look, everybody's all excited. What does Donald Trump say the Federal Reserve needs to cut rates? Well, we need to cut rates so mortgage rates come down, making housing more affordable. Excuse me, the federal funds rate has nothing to do with mortgage rates, folks. The spillover from one to the other is minuscule. You cut the federal funds rate, that doesn't mean mortgage rates are going to come down. I mean, don't get me wrong. Historically speaking, they correlate, but that's because of broader macroeconomic issues, not because the federal funds rate controls the mortgage rate. There's too many layers between those two. If anything, cutting the federal funds rate because of the decline in the dollar, that could actually cause mortgage rates to go up, not down. So we're not going to get out of it what we think. But it probably will cause the stock market to go up, and that just increases the bubble that much more. So maybe we get a little bump out of it. But, you keep bumping, you keep bumping, and keep bumping. Eventually it's morning, and you got a long day ahead of you. We live in weird times, folks. Donald Trump inherited one of the healthiest group of households ever. Low debt, high spending, high income. Everybody across the board, incredibly low poverty rates, living the dream. And yet, we're all pissed and miserable. On the other hand, our macroeconomy is completely out of whack. Massive government borrowing, huge and growing trade deficits, huge inflows of hot money, a dollar that has clearly been pushed too high. All of this says to me the financial markets should be petrified, and they're completely oblivious. Wow. I don't know. Again, I told you at the beginning of this thing, where is this going? Shit, I wish I knew. I'm a forecaster, I'm supposed to tell you, but the most honest thing I can tell you is just how bizarre a place we're in. Look, honestly speaking, at some point in time, these narratives are going to start breaking down. And this is where it's going to start. And when it starts happening here, that's when everything starts to fall apart. What does that look like? Where does that go? Well, okay, the stock market finally blows up, and it starts to drop. The dollar starts to drop with it. Crypto goes with it. The next thing you know, money's not coming here anymore, and interest rates start to go up. What does that do? That starts to put phenomenal pressure on the federal government because just the cost of their existing debt starts rising dramatically. A 1 percentage point increase in the carrying cost of federal debt is $400 billion more in spending. That takes a $2 trillion deficit and turns it into a $2.4 trillion deficit without even blinking. Another percentage point, now it's $2.8 trillion. That quickly starts to spiral out of control. What happens then? Well, one of two things. Either we get dramatic action on the part of Congress, where they cut spending and increase taxes, and that's a huge shock to the system, or they refuse to do that, we start heading for a default, and that's when the Federal Reserve rides the town. Well, what's the Federal Reserve going to do? Well, we've learned over the last couple of years that the Federal Reserve can use quantitative easing with complete impunity. Jerome Powell has told us quantitative easing doesn't cause inflation. Ben Bernanke, Nobel Prize winner, backs him up on that, as does Janet Yellen. So we all know that this is a costless policy solution. We'll just quantitative ease our way out of the problem. Yeah, no, that's not how it works. That will cause inflation, just like it did last time. And all these Nobel Prize winners can sit around and claim quantitative easing had nothing to do with inflation. The answer is, of course it did. Of course it did. And the fact that they can say it out loud and anybody takes it without laughing in their face tells you the power of stupid narratives. So what will they probably do? Well, just like the economists of old told us they were going to do, they're just going to inflate their way out of the mess. Either way you look at it, it's not a pretty picture. Now the question is when does this begin? Could be a year, could be 2 years, could be 3 years. Don't jump, if you will, in your silo just yet. Don't get into that doomsday mode. Go out and make the money you can. People still need homes. People still want to live in California. Even when this mess hits, we'll get through it. We'll get to the other side, and we still have all the fundamentals of an economy. But there is a big bump in the road, a la the Great Recession at some point, and everybody needs to be prepared for that, unlike how people were not prepared last time. So, honest conversation is things are getting risky, but there's still good economic momentum. Simple as that. Got to watch for the turbulence. When do things start? Most important statistic for you is the US dollar. As for our fair state, we continue to be focused on the wrong things. It's housing supply, not housing affordability. It's labor supply, not inequality. Until we get the narrative on the right path, until we start appreciating the value of markets, I don't know where this goes, right? We have to change the narrative in the state. And I think it is starting to change. I will tell you that. Look, the Bay Area, so far off the charts to the left, they are bouncing back. It went too far. It got too ugly. And now you have reasonable mayors in San Francisco, a reasonable mayor in San Jose. You're starting to see the pendulum moving back. And I feel the rest of the state will finally start moving in that direction as well. But of course, as we're moving, we still have this big economic mess in front of us. As for real estate industry, look, things are still good. Affordability is actually improving somewhat because incomes are coming up. People are getting used to interest rates. Putting everything else to one side, I would tell you the year ahead is not going to be great, but it's going to be better than it has been. But with that said, you do have these external circumstances you have to worry about. And in the end, remember, it's the narrative. The narrative's running amok. And, you know, it's hard for me to say that 50 years ago the narratives were as off base as they are today. I feel like today is particularly profound because of the internet. And, in fact, because of this weird world we're in, where we've told people that you're entitled to your opinion. News, you're not entitled to your opinion. The vast majority of people don't have a clue of what they're talking about. Thus, they are not entitled to an opinion. Everybody needs to stay in their lane. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world where any clown can get on TikTok and say whatever nonsense. How many kids do you know get financial advice from TikTok? What in the hell is wrong with us? But, you know, I like to think that human beings adapt. And we'll figure this one out as well. And eventually, we'll get through the mess. Ultimately, it's easier to fool people to convince them they have been fooled. We have a lot of unfooling to do right now. Again, ultimately optimistic, but I will tell you this. In 2005 and 6, when I first met this guy, I was called Dr. Doom because I had this incredibly pessimistic view of the world, supposedly. Turns out, in 2008, I was Dr. Right. And by the way, in 2011, I suddenly became Dr. Sunshine and Light. Because for the next decade, I've been telling everybody, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, get over it, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, to the point where I got bored of myself. Well, now I'm kind of edging back towards Dr. Doom. And maybe this time you should listen to me. But on the other side of that, we'll be fine again. Again, understand the situation, understand the narratives, understand how we need to change the narratives to make the world a better place. And if we all work on that together, perhaps we might just get someplace. And there you go, in a nutshell, so to speak. Did I talk like 3 hours? It felt like it.
That was 90 minutes.
90 minutes, I knew that. I knew I had a lot, but I had
awesome.
fun. Hopefully it wasn't too much
Can't
for you.
imagine. Is this on? Check.
Adam, am I on?
Yeah.
My question is for the rental.
Yeah. Questions about rental.
Yeah, have you done any data on the percentage of on the rental? I hear that the rental is higher than the homeownership right now here in California.
No, absolutely not. The story is where is rental? In LA County, there's more renters than owners.
Okay,
In San Francisco County, there are more renters than owners. The rest of the state's the other way around.
so we're pretty flat.
We're pretty flat. I think overall for the state, I would say the homeownership rate's probably about 55, 56%.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was still homeowners. Yeah.
Raise your hand so I don't have to chase you. I can't believe. I mean, everybody in this room should be like, "What?" This, in many ways, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I was going to say this an hour and a half ago. This reminds me very much of that 2005 Palm
Yeah.
Desert meeting.
Yeah.
I spent damn near the entire weekend with Chris, and I wasn't expecting to feel like I feel right now. Vicky, and then Stacy.
So Lance ended his presentation with what he thought interest rates are going to be. What is your prediction on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, my point, I said to Lance back then, and look, financial markets are volatile and they move on narratives, right? So there's two things here. But this goes back to actually, when I first started doing this, I was on stage and there was another forecaster there, and he was an older guy, and he walked up to me afterwards. He said, "Kid, you're good. You're really good. But I got a word of advice for you, because when it comes to forecasting, give them a number or give them a date, but never give them both." That's what I've done. Even back then, I gave you a number, but I didn't give you a date. But it happened. So now, look, it went up, it stabilized, and I've been saying for a long time, it's not going anywhere. It's not going down, it's not going up. I think mortgage rates, if you hit 6.5%, grab it. Because it's going to be fluctuating between 6.5% and 7.5% until the next big break. The next big break in narrative is when the dollar starts to drop and the money starts to come and the bond auctions are going out and no one's buying. And that's when the 10-year bond goes up and you get another surge in the mortgage rates. What are we going to? I would put us 9%, 9.5%, easy. What do you mean no? I mean, guys, it was 14%, 15% in 1983. The end is not nigh. The market will adjust, but while you're adjusting, there's obviously some big hits to be had. Now, when does it shoot up again? I'm not giving you that date because I don't know. But that's my point. Look, if you're talking to people about buying, my father was a real estate agent. You knew this, right? And I was raised listening to him. He had a broker. He had a small brokerage in Rochester, New York. I was raised on commissions. A couple things to keep in mind here. I asked him once, should you ever trust a real estate agent? And he said, never. And I said, what about you, Dad? And he went, eh. But the second thing he told me was that his two best years were 1983 and 1984. And I went, what the hell, you had double-digit mortgage rates? He said, yeah, but it's about the narrative. It's about the demand. It's about the market and all that kind of stuff. So look, interest rates go up. Everybody's shocked. It feels like the end is nigh. But then people adjust and they get back to it. And you move on. There has to be some repricing. You have to work it out of the system. But higher interest rates, it's just part of it, as the case may be. low interest rates are behind us, right? Eventually we'll go back there, but it's going to be a little bit of time before that point actually happens. So the last thing I will say, and this is something I think you need to tell all your clients, and that's, look, there has been this idea, oh, just buy it, rates will come down. Don't do that to your clients. Explain to them, stay within your means, don't become house poor, don't get stuck on an asset, understand where your income is, where it's going, and make wise decisions about this. We live in a fantastic housing world because we have something that almost no other developed nation has, which is a 30-year fixed rate mortgage that gives you the capacity and ability to plan ahead. So make the right choice. Maybe you're not going to buy the perfect house, but buy a house, get into the market, and start the process. So, nothing here I'm telling you says don't buy a house. What I'm saying is buy a house, but be aware. Yeah.
You said interest rates will be high and then we'll get back to it. What is get back?
Well, eventually things will calm down and they'll drop back down probably to the 5s and 6s, but we're talking a decade from now.
Yeah, by the way, the video will be up. I don't know when Adam's going to get me this video, but maybe.
Adam's going to do the video as soon as he cuts out all the stuff about crypto.
Yeah.
He's going to have to edit all that out.
That is true. That is true. But Adam likes that. Adam likes the 9.5%. Okay, so Chris and Adam have been going back and forth on this for a few years. But I took the mic away from Stacy because, again, just to give Chris a little bit more love on these forecasts. He has said a whole bunch of stuff over the last several years that I'm like, God, I hope he's wrong. As a matter of fact, we were at an event, I don't even remember, I think about 2 years ago, and at that time, something was shifting with the Fed and something was shifting with the bond market.
Yeah, rates came down briefly, and you were
They
crowing.
were coming down briefly, and
Like,
again,
yeah.
I love Barry Habib. The guy's awesome, and Barry was predicting this, and NBA was predicting this, and it was an improvement, lower interest rates. And Chris had just did his presentation, and on his presentation, it said like 7.1% was his rate, which he very rarely has on his presentation. And I pulled him aside and said, dude, you probably want to adjust that because he's going to do another presentation like 3 days later or a week later. It was in LA for CRMLS because I didn't want Chris to embarrass himself.
Ah.
Well, guess what? He did the presentation. He didn't change a damn thing, and he was right.
And I still embarrass myself.
And but you were right, and all of these other smart people that I've been following that I just mentioned were wrong. So when I hear him say, hey, we're going to be 6.5, 7-ish, and there's other people that say we're going to be less, then I don't think I've heard you say north of a 9% rate coming. Whew. Okay, all right, Stacy, you're up.
I actually have the same question she did, but any suggestions you can give us or pointers for this bubble coming?
Again, it's the kind, like, people typically get in trouble when they over leverage themselves. And you're not seeing that in our world. I don't expect to see the same kind of household troubles this time that you saw in 2006 and 7. But that said, again, the government situation is profoundly scary and profoundly dangerous. And that's a whole place we've never been. So I don't have a lot of profound wisdom, except for the fact that I think households will be able to survive through this, but we're going to have to buckle down and watch what happens in D.C. Because D.C. is not a reasonable or rational place right now. And the kind of decisions they could make, who knows, right? So not a lot of words of advice, except for just don't pretend that just because your finances are okay, the nation is okay. We have a big problem. So simple as that. All right, go ahead.
This is wonderful, by the way. You analyze data and articulate it very well. For those of us that are not economists,
Yeah.
and that we do mortgage or real estate or whatever it would be, how often should we be looking at the data? What are some great sources? Are we going to Fred? What are we doing to...
Well, Fred, you already said Fred. I mean, Fred's an amazing story. If you don't know Fred, that's the Federal Reserve Economic Data Warehouse. It's housed at the, I believe, the St. Louis Fed. And it's an amazing data set with all sorts of stuff, hundreds of thousands. That's important. Constantly look at the data. Get your dailies from places that look at data and stuff like that. And even when it comes to like reading stuff, you got to stay away from anything resembling 24 hours news networks. And any type of news source that is working on 30-second bits, they're just looking for head turns. They're just looking for clickbait, right? Headlines are over the top ridiculous. Every time you turn on 24 Hours News Network, it's screaming crisis across the bottom. You got to tune all that crap out. It's become so profoundly over the top. Everything is unprecedented, which is an oxymoron, right? It doesn't work that way, but that's how we're dealing with things. And that means, I would say it's not such a conversation about data as much as it's a broader conversation about what I would call information. And information is data plus people's interpretations of said data. And you have to be just a lot more careful about how you absorb that information. And I tell people, if I had to give you any suggestion, my argument would be read less and read more. Which is to say, don't sit there and scroll through 100 headlines, because every one of those headlines is going to be increasingly insane because they really want you to click on the headline. Instead, pick a few articles and read them. Read them through. Because believe it or not, most reporters truly want to do their job. It's the editor and the headline editor who's worried about the business side of things. And if you read through, you will get different sides of it. And you will start to appreciate the nuance of what's going on. It's also really good, and I think you've told me this as well, but get two sources to give you the same story. If Fox has some story, go read about it on CNN, because you're going to get two sides of it, as the case may be. Externally, if you want to hear about the U.S. economy, it's really hard to get good news on the U.S. economy inside the U.S. Go externally. The Economist is pretty good. Al Jazeera, I know it sounds bizarre, Al Jazeera is great. They have great reporting. They're very neutral. I like them a lot. They're one of the best sources for U.S. news from everybody else's perspective, which is important. We're in a bubble. And that's the most dangerous place to be, because remember, we are reliant on foreign capital. So we better damn well know what the rest of the world thinks about us. So start paying attention to that too. We all have to adapt to an information world that is overwhelming. 100 years ago was the opposite. We didn't have enough information. Today, we have too much information. And we're still adapting to that. And so, you know, you just got to manage and realize that that's what's going on.
Okay, we're going to squeeze in 2 or 3 more. I got to get out of this room here in about 9 minutes or so. If you're in the back and you want to ask a question, come forward, because Laura was a little choppy on the overhead. So Danny, you're up, and then raise your hand if you want to talk one. Okay, 2 and 3.
Do you think BRICS will have a substantial impact?
Who?
BRICS. The BRICS will have.
Yeah, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Will have a substantial impact in devaluing the dollar, and how fast? Do they have any momentum?
No, they look, you know, it's going to be a general issue with investors, not BRICS per se. Look, Brazil's a train wreck. Russia's a bigger train wreck. India has always been a train wreck. And China is becoming the biggest train wreck in the nation. I'm not panicked about these guys. Everybody has their own problems. We all have our own issues. We all have our own narrative issues. You know, don't think about it in that way, right? Yeah, it does to me. It doesn't get you anyplace.
So you talked about the news being all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, what data markers, what data points are you looking for specifically that's going to make you look and say things are turning?
Dollar, U.S. dollar.
That's it.
U.S. dollar is incredibly important, right? That's obviously a place. You want to pay attention to the bond auctions. Those are of interest. 30-year interest rates are doing some 30-year treasuries are doing some interesting things, which you need to be paying attention to. But with that said, the other thing I want you to caution you is a couple weeks or a couple months does not a trend make. Go back to the conversation we had about interest rates, and he goes, dude, I think you need to change that. You're all wrong on that. And I go, wait. And sure enough, it bounced back up. So you want to pay attention to data, but don't over-respond to it, right? I mean, the dollar started to dip. I would say I probably got a little too pessimistic in the start of the year. I saw the dollar drop and the stock market dropped, and I'm like, oh, here we go. And then it stabilized. I'm going to go back to one of the early things I said, which is you give them a date or give them a number. There's no date here. I don't know when this thing pans out. And that's very similar to where I was in 2004 and 5. And I remember I was talking negative in 2005. I had someone come up to me in 2007 screaming at me, "Oh, you ruined my life." Why? Because I was going to buy a house at the beginning of 2006, and I listened to you, you son of a bitch, and you've ruined my life. They didn't call me a year later when turns out I actually saved them from foreclosure. So, you know, I don't want to sit here and tell you, again, don't climb into your bunker, right? But pay attention. When things start to change, be prepared to handle the change, right? Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's what you got to do, as always.
Okay, Norberto's going to take the last one. We'll let Chris answer that. I'm going to take 60 seconds after that to say goodbye, and then we'll be out here in a little bit. Go for it.
Thank you. I have a question regarding basically the insights as to the increase in foreclosures or increase in
No
short
foreclosures.
sales. You don't have anything?
No, there's nothing because people are fine.
Well,
Look, the only, okay, sorry, let me back up. That's not completely true. And I misspoke, so let me back up just a little bit. People have not overborrowed, all right? The mortgage markets have been clean. They've been fairly conservative in terms of their lending. And for the most part, the risks of owning are not being driven by the mortgage markets. Hence, foreclosures in the ways we think about in 2008 are not that big of an issue. That said, there are certain parts of the United States that are having different kinds of issues. For example, a lot of places in the United States have seen very significant increases in home prices, and they don't have Prop 13 protections. And don't get me wrong, Prop 13 was one of the worst disasters of tax law ever perpetuated in the nation of the U.S., right, in the United States of America. That said, when prices do what they do, as they've done over the last few years, it does give us a semblance of protection. Maybe there's something between Prop 13 and no Prop 13. Maybe there's a happy medium where we simply graduate taxes after there's big changes. But they don't do that in Texas. They don't do that in Florida. And so you're having some struggles there. And then you throw in the insurance issue, and again, we have some insurance issues here, but we also have the state pool, which is expensive but manageable. They don't have state pools in Texas. They don't have state pools in Florida. So actually, while we have almost very little increase in inventories, Texas and Florida's housing market and Louisiana's housing market suddenly has a big increase in inventories, and prices are sagging in those particular markets. And that's driven more by the carrying costs of housing rather than, and in California, we don't have those carrying costs that are creating these kind of problems. So I already had too many slides, so I couldn't put that one in there too. But it is interesting in as much as California's housing market has shown more stability than most, in part because of our shortages and because of these protections.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
I don't know if I
thank you.
answered the question, but somewhere
Yeah,
there.
you did.
Yeah.
Okay, how awesome was that?